Hi guys, my long hiatus from YouTube videos is at an end. I realised it was high time to post another one, and that's because a subject matter came to mind yesterday. I made a bit of a slip during a professional assignment, and that's exactly what I want to talk to you about today. A new setting, I know, hopefully slightly better acoustics, but this is but a temporary measure, unfortunately. I am in sunny Winchester, my hometown, for some work over the course of the international break. But let's move on to the subject of today's video. I'm going to talk all about whether or not you can use filling techniques when it comes to conference interpreting. Let me give you a bit more context. Filling is something that TV presenters and indeed football commentators often do when it comes to just biding their time. Perhaps you've got a producer in your ear saying, okay, we've got 20 seconds till the ad break, and you have to fill and you have to make sure that you say something coherent and cogent over the course of that period of time, as opposed to simply sitting there quietly looking awkward or perhaps trying to smile into the camera. And the same goes for sports commentators as well. Our main job is identifying the players when it comes to television commentary, and occasionally you might not necessarily be 100% sure as to which player it is that's done a certain thing. It's particularly relevant when it comes to goal scoring, so we can fill by still talking about the importance of the goal and the beauty of the strike perhaps, and then gradually bringing in the name of the goal scorer at a later date when we're absolutely sure as to who has scored it. Perhaps there's a specific camera angle that shows you the number, or there's a replay, whatever it may be. But the important thing is not to jump in both feet first, which unfortunately is exactly what I did yesterday, albeit on the interpreting side of my career. Now, I love this subject matter of today's video because it is very rare that I have a topic that straddles both sides of my career. So conference interpreting on the one hand and sports commentary on the other. And yet that's exactly what happened yesterday. To give you a bit more background, I was interpreting on a matchday -1 press conference for Italy on the eve of their game against Belgium, the third place playoff for the UEFA Nations League Final Four. And Roberto Mancini, the Italy head coach, was joined by Jorginho. Now, this was not a coincidental choice of player to put up in the press conference. The reason that the Italian media had the opportunity to speak to the midfielder was because presumably someone at the FIGC, the Italian FA, in their press office has seen all of the headlines with the talk of Jorginho perhaps winning the Ballon d'Or. He was included on the 30-man shortlist, one of 5 Italians up for the award for the best footballer of the last year by France Football magazine. Now, what happened was, naturally, there was a lot of interest in who Roberto Mancini, the Italy head coach, would vote for if he had the opportunity to choose who should win the Ballon d'Or. To which he replied,
Se devo dare a uno, per me il pallone d'oro lo deve vincere Giorgio.
Now, you don't necessarily need to speak Italian to have heard the name Giorgio there. The issue comes about when you actually look at the identity of those 5 Italians on the 30-man shortlist. We have Gigio Donnarumma, Leonardo Bonucci, Nicolo Barella, Giorgio Chiellini and Jorginho. Now, the issue is, I heard Giorgio and I immediately started to interpret by saying Giorgio Chiellini. The reason why is because when I hear a name in a press conference, if it's just a first name, a Christian name, I tend to always add the surname when I know it so that there's no ambiguity for my listener. And when it's just the surname, I tend to add the first name. So as soon as I heard Giorgio, I instinctively started interpreting and said I would give it to Giorgio Chiellini. And then my heart sank when I realised that Mancini was actually speaking about Jorginho, the player alongside him, once there was greater context.
Perché ha vinto Coppa dei Campioni, Coppa Europa, FA Cup, insomma.
When he started to say Jorginho won the Champions League, he won the FA Cup, he won Euro 2020, and as soon as I heard him say he won the Champions League, I realised no, Chiellini plays for Juventus, they haven't won Europe's Premier Club competition for a long while now, it clearly can't be Chiellini. So I then had to quickly correct myself, which is never ideal. It's similar to a football commentator who has to correct himself if he makes a mistake on a goal, and then you perhaps lose some credibility with your listener, which is the last thing I want to do. So then I grappled with it after the press conference. I was kicking myself. I thought, why did you jump in? Because in conference interpreting, we work with a technique which is called décalage, essentially the distance between the original speaker and the interpreter themselves. Ordinarily, in theory, the greater the décalage, the better the rendition should be, provided you can recall everything that you've just heard, because it gives you that time to think about what's been said, to process it, to perhaps change the word order so it's more appropriate for your target language, and to come out with the most coherent solution possible. The issue is that I tend to have less décalage because I don't rely as much on my short-term memory, and specifically to football, because coaches and players tend to speak very fast, you don't necessarily have as much of an opportunity to let half a unit or a full meaning unit go by before you start interpreting. On top of that, because press conferences, we tend to often share a language with English as the relay language. For instance, yesterday I don't speak Flemish, so when there was a question in Flemish, I had to wait for my colleague to interpret it into English before I could then render it into Italian. I am loath to have too much décalage at the tail end of an answer before a question then comes in, for fear of missing the start of the following question from the journalist. I hope you're able to keep up with all of this. So I was starting to think, how could I have avoided this mistake? Because essentially there were 5 possible names he could have chosen. He said Jorginho, I said Chiellini, and I had to correct myself. It's not a good look. And I started to think about the techniques that we use in football commentary and indeed in TV presenting when it comes to filling. But I don't know if these are necessarily suitable for conference interpreting, because if you do fill, so by coming out with additional content, essentially, by saying a line that the coach hasn't necessarily said, you are attributing comments to them that they haven't actually made. And that's a very dangerous game when it comes to conference interpreting. You shouldn't ever really detract from the meaning. You shouldn't add anything. Where possible, you should be as faithful as possible to what they've said. I think the best approach would have been to have just waited a little bit longer, or even come out with a filler word, something like well, which is not really particularly big offence if you were to attribute the word well to the head coach. No one's going to accuse you of misinterpreting there. And just buy time to hear that additional context. The issue is that I didn't necessarily realise it was an ambiguous phrase in the first place. So that additional context came as soon as he started to list the players' trophy haul over the last 12 months. In hindsight, had I started backwards and then work towards the front, that might have also helped me. It's a similar technique that I've heard from people who tend to do consecutive interpreting without notes. Maybe they'll start with the last meaning unit, the last idea, because that's the closest thing to recall, and then gradually work their way backwards, provided, of course, that it doesn't disrupt the flow and the meaning. So perhaps I could have started by saying, well, because he won Euro 2020 and the Champions League and the FA Cup, I would, of course, vote for Jorginho. In hindsight, that would have been the right way to go about things, but it's always a lot easier in hindsight. It's 2020. But there you have it. So I'm just wondering whether any filling techniques can be appropriate for conference interpreting. I'd love to get the thoughts of student interpreters, budding interpreters, professional conference interpreters working in the industry at this moment in time, and also any of you that are looking to get into broadcasting in general. It just shows that we can make mistakes if we're not on our toes. And one final point, it's also very important that conference interpreters can see the person that they are interpreting. Why? Because watching the clip back, I realised that Jorginho was actually the person indicated by Mancini. He actually put out his arm towards the player on his right, which would have been a really clear indication that he was talking about the midfielder as opposed to Giorgio Chiellini. Similarly, if you think logically, it would have been a real slight from his head coach had Mancini said Chiellini instead of Jorginho, particularly with the latter sat alongside him. That's where logic comes into things. That's where knowing your subject matter is all important. Typically, being forewarned is forearmed when it comes to conference interpreting. The more you know about your subject matter, the more you read around the subject matter, the better the opportunity you have to get things right. Because occasionally when there are ambiguous sentences, you can just allow your background knowledge to kick in and give you a helping hand. So there you go. Sbagliando si impara, as they say in Italy. You learn by making mistakes, and that's hopefully a mistake I won't be making going forward. But it did just give me some food for thought, which is why I wanted to make a video about it. Subscribe to my channel if you enjoy my content and want to see more of it. Comment below if you have any thoughts on this. And I will see you on the next video. Who knows when that will next be, but I'm looking forward to it nonetheless. Cheers, guys.